Okay, thank you very much, Nick. Well, welcome everybody to our webinar today, which is going to be on the student experience of finding student accommodation, which is going to be presented by Rhiannon Clark, our Marketing and Research Executive here at Accommodation for Students. For those that don't know me, I'm Simon Thompson. I'm founder of Accommodation for Students. I've been running it for the last 22 years. We've had a really busy start to the year, which has been very interesting. Again, record inquiries. It doesn't seem to be holding up at all. Demand for student accommodation is really strong in the last couple of years. November, December were very busy months, and again, it's just not holding up at the moment. We're still really busy with strong inquiries, and our customers reporting that they've already pre-filled their accommodation for the year much earlier than they would normally. So today, obviously, talking about the student experience of finding accommodation, there is quite a lot happening within the student space at the moment. Obviously, cost of living is a big thing. You probably heard in the news today that some students have actually barricaded themselves at Manchester University as a result of rent strikes. So there are pockets of students that are not happy at the moment with the cost of living, and hopefully this report and review today will give you some useful insights on how students are finding things at the moment. So I'll pass you over to Rhiannon and enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Hiya. I think Nick was just going to quickly introduce the PowerPoint here. If I could pass you over to Nick.
Yep. So in terms of the session today, there's been, I think, the context of when we did this research really was there was a lot of national coverage about a sort of quote unquote student accommodation crisis. So particularly through the autumn and winter. So we wanted to understand, you know, what the situation was in relation to students, actually how that impacted on them, how they felt about the experience of finding student accommodation, and really get that student insight. A, to kind of improve our understanding, but B, to start seeing how this might be affecting behaviour and what trends we could identify. So that's really what we did, and we've done both in-depth interviews with students, focus groups, and a survey. So Rhiannon is going to talk you through the research which she analysed. We also do have a student panel, so some of the students that were involved in the research have kindly agreed to attend today. So if you've got any questions, pop them into the Q&A channel, and then we'll bring the students in the panel online in a moment after the session to answer the questions and to give a little bit more insight. So hand back over to you, Rhiannon.
Thank you very much, both of you. Just want to check everyone can hear me. Give me a thumbs up.
I can.
Fab. So yeah, I'm Rhiannon. I basically analysed this data, so we thought it'd be great if I sort of went through and spoke through some of these graphs to you and sort of what our general findings were in this data. Again, if anyone wants to jump in, Nick and Simon, and just add anything you think I've missed, feel free. But yeah, this data was collected between the 21st of October to the 14th of December 2022, so during the autumn of last year, and we managed to get data from 1,154 participants across 78 student cities, which is a great, like a large and diverse sample. We had like many numbers of students from London, Manchester, Glasgow, York and Bristol in this survey as well. So quite big student cities. We also managed to get data from quite a lot of different year groups. So we had about 33% first years, 28% were postgraduate students, and then 19% and 16% were second and third years respectively, sorry. So yeah, just a good sample of different year groups. If we could go to the next slide, please, that'd be great. So firstly, we just sort of wanted to look at the numbers of students who'd actually secured accommodation for the current year. Obviously, there's been a lot of, you know, information in the media about students having not secured accommodation. We sort of wanted to see what the consensus was at this point in time. And from looking at the data, obviously, of 81% having secured their accommodation, that is the vast majority. But, you know, this is one out of 5 students here actually haven't secured their accommodation at this point as September 2022, which is actually, I would say a relatively large proportion. But looking at the qualitative data here, a lot of these students were maybe starting studying a postgrad in January, or they graduated, or they were taking a leave of absence, or studying at home. So this could be partially what this 20% is here. So we sort of started our research by asking students when they started searching for their accommodation, go to the fab, and see when students are generally looking. And I expected to see a sort of autumn cycle, but actually looking at this data here, it looks like there's more of a sort of spring summer cycle. So out of these 904 responses, the most common time to start looking for your accommodation for this year starting September 2022 was actually in August, which was surprising, and the median time was in the April. So initially looking at this data, it actually looks like, there's sort of like a spring summer cycle here, which was absolutely not what I expected to find. We also looked at when students found their accommodation. And the most common time was September 2022 for the September 22, which again, a surprising statistic. And the median was the July 2022. So on the surface, it sort of looks like students are sort of organising their accommodation quite late and outside this sort of expected autumn cycle. But we did look into sort of the, demographics of the sample, and with such a large proportion being first years and postgrads, so 33% first years and 28% postgrads, we decided to look at this data without these. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this data here excludes the first years. Obviously, a lot of first years won't sort of start looking at their accommodation and securing their accommodation until the August during A-level results day, when they can accept a place onto uni, or when they may end up in clearing and have to sort accommodation that way. And as soon as we remove the first years from this sample, you can see two key points emerging. You've got this autumn cycle on the left and this spring summer cycle still on the right. So this, we've got two main points here. And then again, if we go to the next slide, we've got the data excluding the postgrads. So again, postgrads will start their courses at different points in the year. There's, your January starters and your September starters. And often, people will be applying for their courses maybe around this time, and they won't start looking for their accommodation until they're accepted onto a course. So this again could just affect when students are looking. But once we're just looking at our second and third years, our usual undergraduate continuing students, it's quite clear that there is an autumn cycle here. So here from the graph, we can see that November and January are the most common times to be looking for accommodation. So I guess the takeaway here is that although the autumn cycle is probably the most common among our continuing undergraduate students, there is also this time in the spring and summer where a lot of housing can go as well. And we also thought it would be great to sort of look at specific city hotspots and see, if this differed between cities, and how the time taken to actually secure accommodation could differ between cities. So looking at the timings, the average time, as you can see on the orange bar on the right, to secure accommodation was 1.6 months, so the equivalent of a month and 24 days. And the time did differ quite drastically between cities. So as you can see where the big bar is, where the mouse is, Durham students are taking 3.4 months, Dublin is 2.9 months, Glasgow is 2.4, along with Bristol, which is on the left, and Newcastle is 2.2 months. So it's initially sort of unclear what these numbers might mean, but my sort of inclination is that these cities where students are taking a long time to find accommodation, they may be sort of experiencing quite a fast-paced market where houses are going up on one day, and by the end of the day maybe they've been let already, so they might be experiencing a lot of rejections, which means they have to start the whole process again of researching, viewing, doing the documentation, and this just makes the process quite long. And this is generally likely to be due to a lack of supply for the demand, which again is no surprise that cities like Glasgow, Bristol and Dublin are then the cities where you're experiencing these long amounts of time to secure accommodation. On the other hand, however, there's some cities where it's actually it seems to be fast to secure accommodation. So we're looking at Brighton and Liverpool, you're taking 0.6 months, Edinburgh 0.9, and then Nottingham and Sheffield 1.2 months. And this is maybe the opposite pattern. So maybe students are actually signing up for a house and, you know, being accepted onto the first property they look for, and they're able to sort of find a property that they like quite quickly, likely due to quite a large supply, which is no surprise when you're seeing that some of these cities are Nottingham and Sheffield, where the markets aren't quite as tough. We also wanted to look into the difficulty finding student accommodation. So obviously, as we've been seeing in the media, it's quite difficult, or the media is saying it's quite difficult to find housing, especially in these cities that we discussed, Glasgow, Dublin, etc. But we actually, so this bar graph sort of shows the number of students reporting each level of difficulty, with 0 being really easy and 10 being really difficult. And the average difficulty score that students gave was 5.9, which is kind of just above the halfway mark. And actually, I would say this resembles neither difficult nor easy. So in general, students are experiencing quite a neutral level of difficulty when it comes to securing their accommodation. Even when I remove first years from this analysis, who, you know, are often getting their accommodation guaranteed and they don't even have to look, the difficulty only increased to 6.18, so an increase of 0.28. So the general consensus is, I think, that students aren't finding the housing market too difficult. I think it's important to note that the 10, the most difficult extreme score on here, is the most commonly reported, but some people are having also really easy experiences, as you can see from the 0. I think that was a 77 frequency. So it's quite polarizing. And I think you can only really sort of get to understand this data when you look a bit more closely, again, at specific cities. So as you can see on the far right of this graph in the orange, that's our average of 5.9, and you can see all the different cities across. These were the cities that had 10 or more observations, so it doesn't include quite every city, but sort of the main student cities are in here. And again, the difficulties are in, like, the most difficult cities were Dublin with a score of 8.6, Glasgow with 8.1, Cambridge with a score of 7, and then London was 6.9 and Hull was 6.7. So these were our most difficult cities. But even once you're getting down to the 6.9 and the 6.7 compared to our average of 5.9, even London and Hull don't seem too difficult. I think the main cities we want to be looking at here are Dublin and Glasgow. And again, the opposite was also the case. So we have some cities which actually students were saying are relatively easy to secure accommodation in. So Portsmouth had a score of 3.2, Coventry 3.9, Nottingham was a score of 4, Liverpool was 4.1, and Plymouth was 4.6. So clearly there's some cities where actually the process is relatively easy, and all this sort of hysteria in the media isn't actually really relevant to someone who might be studying in these cities. So I think just looking at these local differences is really important. We also sort of wanted to look into what these difficulties students were experiencing were. So this is sort of like an overview of the difficulties students experienced. And among the students who answered this question, the score reported was a 9, the average score. So this is more of a representation of the main difficulties experienced by those who actually experienced the difficulties in the first place. So as I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone, the most sort of commonly reported difficulty was that the student accommodation was full or that it was too expensive, which both situations are quite intertwined. But yeah, unsurprising, and things that I thought would be quite a deal breaker, such as the not fitting needs bar, which sort of maybe for me would be about, you know, the location, are the bedrooms a good size? Is the house nice? Students don't seem to be too bothered. They just want to know that they've physically got somewhere to live that they can afford to live in. And if we go to the next slide as well, there's a bit of a summary of what all these different sort of bars mean and what the students were saying. Just be quiet for a couple of seconds so you can have a read. And we also wanted to look at, so on the next slide, we wanted to look at what the main issues were in each city. We could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so across the board, these were sort of a small group of cities because there just wasn't quite enough data to go into too much depth. But across the board, the housing crisis is the purple line. This is like the main thing that students are reporting in basically every city, and closely followed by financial issues, which is the blue line. So, you know, houses being within budget. The financial issues seem to be most prevalent in York, London, and Dublin, and Kingston upon Thames as well. But across the board, mainly it is these issues with shortages that students are facing. So we then decided to sort of look into rent expectations for the coming year. If we could have the next slide, please. So this was quite a surprising finding I found. So we sort of expected students to anticipate paying more next year just because, you know, house prices are going up every year, but 58% were saying they were expecting to pay the same, which I think was a little naive and maybe unrealistic. But you know, we had a chat about this and we were like, this is quite an interesting reflection on students' mindsets. Like, you know, they're not expecting houses to increase. Maybe they're really relaxed about the process, and maybe even a little naive. But you know, even some students, we had some qualitative data were saying they expected to pay less or they hadn't even thought about it. So, you know, I think it shows that students are quite relaxed about the whole process, maybe more than they should be. I'm not sure, but you know, an interesting finding, I thought. The next set of data, we sort of wanted to look into students' anticipations for finding their next lot of student accommodation. So we asked them when they intended to start searching, and quite clearly from the graph, basically all the students were anticipating an autumn cycle looking between October to January. So yeah, quite an early market. And one of the concerns we had was maybe, you know, all the panic in the media is actually driving students to look earlier than they need to and rush, and they might be, you know, causing each other to panic and look earlier, and just artificially moving this market forward. Whereas like in cities like Portsmouth and Coventry, actually you don't need to be looking this early, especially not in these October, November times. So that was a bit of a concern, but you know, it's good to know that students in these difficult cities do know that they need to be looking early. We also then wanted to see what sorts of accommodation were most in demand. So on the next slide, we've got a pie chart. And as you can see from the pie chart, students generally are looking at being in a shared house or a flat or apartment in those cities where that's more common. And, you know, uni halls and private halls seem to be a less common preference, especially for people, you know, beyond first year. And I thought this was quite interesting. I think when most students, you know, think about what their university experience is going to be like, I know myself, I personally imagine myself living in a shared house with all my friends. And I do think it's just part of the uni lifestyle and culture, which is why these types of accommodation are in such high demand. But yeah, obviously these are the most commonly lived in houses and types of accommodation as well. And we've got really relatively low scores for things like living at home and halls sort of beyond first year. On the next slide, we asked students how they found their experience finding their accommodation last year, and we sort of wanted to look into adjectives describing this experience. So this was, I think this was about, I want to say around 800 responses of qualitative data. And I sort of went through and just picked out these adjectives and sort of coded them. And we kind of found two sort of clusters, which was these hard, stressful adjectives, disappointing, you know, unsuccessful, basically loads of adjectives that sort of were synonyms for each other in saying that their accommodation hadn't been great. And this was unfortunately 69% of students. However, we did have 14% of students saying that they'd found the process really easy, it was good, it was quick, you know, it'd been quite smooth. So this is good to see. We also had numbers of students obviously mentioning how expensive it has gotten and the housing crisis. But I think it's good to note that despite, you know, 69% of students saying that it was a hard process, 81% of them had still secured accommodation by September 2022. So I think students are being quite resilient, and they are sort of, you know, facing these difficulties head on and dealing with them and still, you know, finding themselves accommodation. We then asked students how difficult they anticipated finding this experience, looking for next year's accommodation. And we wanted to sort of see if this was an increase. Obviously, we know that inflation is happening and every cohort every year is increasing. So it is getting more competitive, and there's only so fast that, you know, student homes can be built and made available. But the average difficulty increased here from the previous analysis from 5.9 to 6.55, which is, I would say, quite a small increase, an increase of 0.65. So that's quite it's quite good to see, quite a positive finding. I think it is still important to note again that, you know, we do have high numbers of students reporting a difficulty level of 10, a difficulty level of 8, and a difficulty level of 5, which is all sort of in the more difficult zone. But overall, again, this is what I think would be quite a neutral difficulty, neither easy nor difficult, at, you know, a score of 6.55. So I think we need to remember that these really tough experiences are most likely to be in these cities like Glasgow, Dublin, Bristol, Durham, where the housing market is competitive. And again, we looked, if we go on the next slide, about the cities where students are having the most difficulty. And again, we can see some that are much higher than others. We've got a sort of like a summary on the next slide, actually, which might be easier to look at. So as we can see on here, the least difficult cities were Coventry, Portsmouth, Norwich, Birmingham, and Nottingham. And the most difficult were, as expected, cities like Dublin, Glasgow, Durham, Bristol, Dundee, and Sunderland. But I think even when you're getting down to Dundee and Sunderland with 7.17 and 7.14 compared to an average of 6.55, I would say these aren't actually drastically difficult. I think the key cities to look at here are Dublin, Glasgow, and Durham. And I think it's important to remember that there's these extreme difficulties in these cities on the left, where actually the process has been relatively easy and it's not been, you know, difficult like, you know, students may have been worrying that it might be. Yeah, if we could go to the next slide, please. So students that were then asked to tell us what was informing this level of difficulty that they reported. And as seen in previous analyses, students are generally citing this supply and demand issue and their budgets. But I do think it's interesting. We have a bar here that says getting organised, which basically a lot of students were saying, you know, I plan to be organised, I plan to look early. I understand the city that I'm living in now, where I want to live. I understand the process of house hunting. So a lot of students were really optimistic about, you know, their house hunt going forward next year, which was really good to see. And I don't think students were being particularly picky either. I think, you know, all these bars down here about the housing fitting their needs and, you know, their personal situation were relatively small compared to just students thinking, right, I need somewhere physically to live that I can afford. So it's good to see that students were sort of, you know, looking at these issues mostly that were actually going to affect whether they had somewhere to live in the first place. The next slide here just gives us a bit more of an in-depth sort of student perspective. There was some good qualitative data. I'll just give you a chance to read it so you can sort of see a bit more of an insight. I believe this blue response on the right was a student in Plymouth, and the pink purple one was a student in Norwich as well. But yeah, just a little bit more of a personal insight that I personally found quite interesting. That's everything to do with the stats. I hope that's been interesting, and I will pass you back to Nick.
Thanks very much, Rhiannon. So kind of then looking at what we found and therefore what we might think the implications are really. So I think despite the wider coverage about a crisis, most students are taking this in the stride, and I think it was quite heartening to understand that the evidence was that students weren't finding it particularly challenging to find accommodation. And whilst the qualitative research did sort of indicate students were quite stressed about finding accommodation, that is a key theme that we've tracked over a decade really, and students don't necessarily find it not stressful finding accommodation in the best of times really. So I think really more than ever what we're looking at is a sort of polarized market where there are sort of hotspots with undersupply of accommodation. For example, Glasgow, where there are specific reasons for it, i.e. lack of HMOs, partly which is policy driven, whereas there are plenty of cities where those challenges don't exist. So I think that context is very important, and in those tough cities it is simply a lack of supply and challenges around inflated rent, which you get with a lack of supply. But as Rhiannon highlighted, and I think this is really interesting, that when we did the survey and did the focus groups in October, November, most students weren't expecting to pay more rent in 2023, despite the evidence of all the inflationary pressures that existed, for example, interest rates or fuel, which will inevitably drive up rent. So I think it just presents this kind of more relaxed mindset than we might have otherwise anticipated, given all of this coverage that we had. There was other insight. I mean, we got a lot of positive feedback about accommodation for students, which was great. There was also a sense that students were getting, through the cycle more experienced in looking for accommodation. And that once you got through those initial difficulties, you became better at it and more confident about looking for accommodation, which was positive. And then there was a theme that was emerging, and it came from probably students in those more challenging cities, that they were looking for more information and advice, and that there was a gap there, particularly from universities, in terms of advising them what to do and what should be done. So what are the lessons? So in terms of my key takes here is that I think firstly, as Rhiannon has highlighted, the autumn cycle for first years moving on thinking about accommodation for the following year, or second and third years, that autumn cycle is really well established. So there's that cycle, and it's become really deeply embedded in student culture. And what has happened though, that the outside noise from media coverage, I think, has dragged the market forward even earlier. So a lot of our in-depth interviews in and around the survey would indicate students in, say, for example, cities like Sheffield, who had started their accommodation search a little bit earlier than even normal, even though they were fully aware and absolutely knew that they didn't need to do that because there was plenty of accommodation. So the implications for landlords, PBSAs and agents in cities where there isn't an undersupply is that the market's probably gone a little bit early this year, and that will even out mid-market. So I, for example, see a lot of PBSAs talking about how far ahead they are in occupancy than they were in 2022, and I think in a decent number of those cities that'll even out come the mid-cycle, so from March onwards, where that kind of the impact of students going earlier than normal will kind of unravel. Even though it has been amplified by the media coverage, I do think that kind of bubble is still there. It's very much a word of mouth thing. in whichever city that students feel they need to go early. What's happening, by the way, in the summer is we are getting, I think we've got 200,000 more full-time postgraduates in the UK now. So that spike in summer from postgraduates is that late postgraduate market. Now that is bad for a postgraduate if you're in a tough city like Bristol, because if you are entering the accommodation market in August, that's tough. It's great for a landlord or PBSA in, say, Coventry, because if you get in a postgraduate entering the market in August, that fills up your capacity. So that's what's going on in the summer, plus a decent amount of first years who are going through the clearing process. So that's that secondary spike, which is becoming more pronounced, and it is primarily, I would say, postgraduate driven. So that's kind of my take on what the lessons are. And then just to really focus on, I think that there is the need for sort of key advice in certain cities. So to my mind, you know, the likes of Glasgow, Dublin, Bristol, there needs to be advice to students who are thinking about accepting a place at university in the summer, to think again, because you need to have some form of accommodation organised before you accept your place there. And that's a piece of work that we will do with our students, just to make sure that people are aware of that and they're not in a difficult situation. So that's kind of our key take on what we think about the research, the findings. We've got a few of the students that participated in the research who are going to join us. So if you guys could turn your cameras on, that would be fantastic. While they are kind of warming up, we have had a few questions, and I was going to say, and I should have said at the start, the session is recorded, and I will send it round. So everyone will get a link to the session, so you can watch it at your leisure. Somebody's asked about decision making around how students decide what type of accommodation, and that's really timely. We have just updated our survey on how students find accommodation. So we did present in 2021 a big piece on how students go about choosing between different types of accommodation, and what those decision-making points were. So that will be available probably next month or the month after, and we will do a session on it. One good thing, I think, for all of us here is there's about 1.7 million to 1.8 million students currently looking for, in the market for student accommodation. The sector is growing. There are 625,000 PBSA bed spaces, so there's a lot for both PBSA and landlords and letting agents to go at. So in terms of other questions that we have had, we've got a question around, from a student perspective, does the kind of media noise around, accommodation crisis and stuff kind of impact on your decision making about when you start looking, or is it not something you consider? Anna, have you got a view on that?
Yeah, so a bit of context, I'm a second year and I'm in Bristol, so I'm in kind of one of the hotspot cities, which is just kind of something to consider. So at first, when I was looking kind of for third year, I didn't really consider any of the media news, just because my house search for second year went pretty smoothly and it was quite easy. But then pretty quickly, once I started looking for houses, I realized that Bristol was one of the cities that had issues. So a lot of the times, Rhiannon was saying about how the houses would be off the market really quickly. So if you'd see a house that was posted 2 hours before and you called them, they'd already be fully booked. You couldn't even get a viewing. So everything was going really quickly. And if you did manage to get a viewing, you would kind of go in and they'd be maybe 3, 4, 5 other groups that's booked in the same 5-minute time slot as you. So you'd all be going through the house together. And the houses are obviously not very big as it is. So there's just a lot of students in one little house trying to view it as quickly as possible because there's 3 other groups behind you. So initially, no, I didn't let the media affect it. But then because I was in Bristol and it actually kind of was the reality here, I kind of did have to start acting a bit quicker.
Okay, thanks very much. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would say naturally there is a lot of pressure to sort of find accommodation early on in the year. For context, I'm third year at Newcastle, and I felt that even though there isn't necessarily a housing shortage, there was sort of the sort of cycle of panic, as Rhiannon highlighted earlier, that sort of it makes you feel like you have to sort of even go for a viewing earlier on, probably before this Christmas period.
Cool.
I'd say it is the media that stresses people out, but also just general kind of like social media and just friends. Like if you hear other people looking, it makes you a lot more stressed. I think you should look. And I agree with the point of so many people go to house viewings at the same time. Like I once went to a house viewing and we were like, oh yeah, like we might go for it. And they said that there was already 2 people that had been before us. So they said that if we wanted it, we had to like confirm straight away pretty much. And it's just such a hard decision to confirm straight away because you need to think about it.
Thanks, Ellie. Eleanor?
For me, I'm in Sheffield, and so we were told quite early on by our university that we didn't need to worry about the student houses because there's so many that there's a surplus of them. But we ignored that advice from university, and just because again because of social media and like speaking to your friends, and everyone is booking and everyone's looking and telling you like that the good houses are going to go, and so we booked early on even though we'd been told not to.
Do you think that was common in Sheffield, Eleanor? Do you think that was, a lot of your peers did the same as you?
Yeah, I mean, we booked in December, and even like that for us felt very early to be booking and choosing who we're living with because I'm in my first year as well. But speaking to my friends, I think like some people were booking in October. I don't know anyone who hadn't booked like by like at least January who hadn't sorted out for second year where they were living. So it's definitely quite common, yeah.
Great stuff, thanks. And then just sort of picking up on that theme, Anna, is there anything that you would do differently, knowing what you know now and having had your experience of sort of looking for accommodation for a couple of years, what would you do differently?
I think I would maybe try and keep up with it a bit more. Like I know the Bristol Uni did a house drop, their lettings did, and I didn't really know the day. So maybe I would have tried to pay attention more and would have started looking a bit earlier. But at the same time, the houses just kind of go so quickly. I don't know if there was anything else that I could have done, because I think we did start looking like relatively early as well, I would say. Like November we started, so that is quite early. So I don't know how much earlier really we could have gone.
Thanks. Anyone else would think about doing something differently? Eleanor, what about you? Would you do something differently next year in a city with lots of accommodation?
I would just do the opposite. I think my plan for next year is to look later on and not rush into booking something and to really be sure, because there's just, I mean, even like if you look now, there would be so many houses and flats in Sheffield, like in all different price ranges as well. So I think go for the year, like for my third year house, I won't look as early and won't let it cause us so much stress, because it was just a lot of unnecessary stress.
Okay, cool.
I was gonna say, I think I'm the same as Eleanor there, because in Nottingham there is a lot of housing, but quite a lot of it is run down or it's being done up. So we kind of rushed into it. We didn't look at the area too much. We didn't properly look at the house because we were like stressed and rushing. But there is a lot of housing, as the like questionnaire showed. So I just wish we didn't rush and we really took our time to find a place that was like worth the money and up to a good standard.
Thanks. Denise, anything from your side?
Yeah, I agree. I think I would have definitely taken my time more and really looking at the area and also researching the letting agencies as well. But on the flip side, I feel that sometimes the earlier you start looking, the less stressful it might be to take your time with it as well. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Right, okay. Just we've had quite a lot of questions come in as you've been speaking. So we've had about 20 questions come in, and one of the themes actually is around bills inclusive. And Firstly, one of our participants has asked, how important is it? Well, our research still shows it's the third most important reason when students are considering finding somewhere, that after location and price, the availability of inclusive bills. Can I just see what your views are on that, guys, in terms of, does that resonate with you in terms of the importance of bills inclusive? And can you just let me know what you expect to happen with costs and things like that over the next 12 months? So Anna, would you mind just taking that one first?
Yeah, I don't think bills inclusive is very high on my priority list, but I think it's also.
Have you got bills included in your current accommodation?
No, so I don't have it in my current. I had it first year because I was in halls, but I've not had it now, and I won't have it next year as well. I think it's like a personal thing though. I know some students definitely would prefer it, and I think it would be a lot nicer to have. Like I would enjoy it, but if a house doesn't have bills inclusive, it's not like a deal breaker. I won't say no to a house just because of that, but that might also be because I'm in Bristol and you don't really have the opportunity to say no to a house anyway.
Take what you can get, fair enough. Any other views, please?
For me, it was kind of the opposite of that. Like when we started looking for our house, we had a little list going of all the things that we needed, and we said we were not going to look at anywhere that didn't have the bills included, just because we were so scared that we might get to the midway through our year and the bills go up, and we're like, oh my god, like we're already trying to afford our rent, and it would just be too stressful to have to worry about our bills separately. I think even if they stayed the same price, it would just be like another thing to be thinking about while we're at uni, and it would just be a lot easier for it to all be like in one package. So it was quite important for us.
Okay.
Originally, I was the same as that. I felt very stressed and I really wanted bills included because I was worried about the increase, because obviously it was saying it was going to get doubled and tripled. But then we found a house that wasn't bills included, so we didn't really have a choice. But now that I've gone bills excluded, I wouldn't go back because we have saved so much money. We expected to be spending a lot more on bills than we have, because I have paid for water, Wi-Fi and electricity all separately. So I haven't gone for a student bills either. And it has saved us a lot of money. And I think it just shows that sometimes the student bills, you get extra charges. So I don't think it's a deal breaker personally.
Good. Denisia, do you have bills included where you live?
Yes, I do. I think I had a sort of a similar experience to Eleanor in the sense that we were quite worried about the unpredictability that would come with sort of the increasing costs. So we thought it would be a lot less hassle to go with a bills inclusive option. But that being said, I think we'd probably be saving more if we did it ourselves.
Great, thank you very much. It might be helpful as well for some landlords on the session to know that for the first time ever, we've had some of our PBSAs on accommodation for students who've started to introduce sort of fair usage policies and stuff on bills. So it is an area that's quite challenging across the piece, really. Just one last question. I'm conscious of time. So is there anything that you'd like to see done sort of differently in the student accommodation market? Anything you think should change? And, in particular, anything that you think, might be useful advice?
I think, I know this might be a bit more like uni related, but I think kind of Bristol University was a little bit underprepared and maybe a little bit ignorant about the situation just for students, because when they did do the house drop, people were queued like up to an hour before the office even opened, and our website would only be live for like a minute before it crashed again.
Okay.
You couldn't call, you couldn't email. My friend and I were in the queue outside for like over 2 hours trying to get a viewing. So I just don't think they expected as much like kind of panic from students as there was. And they did do it a bit differently. After Christmas, they did another house drop where instead of doing all of the houses one morning, they spread it out over like 2 weeks where they just drop a couple houses every day, which made a lot more sense because there wasn't just like a line of students outside the SU lettings. So I don't know if that's really advice towards like landlords, because that is
no
like the university, but yeah,
it's a great piece of advice, Anna, because one of the landlords or one of the participants has commented, you know, Bristol's always been a difficult city for 12, 13 years. It's always been a tough city. And because the university is recruiting more students, it's made that more difficult. And actually, the Vice Chancellor's response was to blame landlords for the housing crisis, which was, it probably shows a bit of denial. So that's yeah, a pretty good summary of the situation. Anyone else got any sort of things they'd like to see done differently?
I think also a uni-related thing, I would like to see sort of more guidance on like the practical elements of finding a house, such as things to look for, and also breaking down contracts, because they can be difficult to understand.
Thank you.
For me, I think it would be nice to for kind of when we're going for viewings at properties to kind of have less pressure from landlords when we're viewing. Like, it was kind of similar thing where there'd be big groups of people coming to view the houses, and then if we were like, oh, this is quite a nice one, they'd be like, well, you need to book it now because we've got 3 groups after you and we've just had these many groups and it's going to go. And it just makes it a lot more stressful and overwhelming. It just makes it harder than I think it needs to be.
Okay, thanks.
I just think communication is so important, because I'm in 3rd year, and in 2nd year, my landlord was so nice. She introduced herself. She gave us a tour of the flat, everything. Whereas this year, I haven't met the landlord. I don't even know his name. So it's just quite hard to contact. It feels like you are just being used for your money. And I know that when you go to viewings, obviously they want to sell it quickly, but it would just be nice to have a bit more communication and feel like you're wanted to live there, just because it's nice.
Cool. Okay, thanks very much. So I think I am conscious of time. I think just one little thing to highlight before. Someone's asked what type of information and support, you know, would you like from your university? And I think part of the thing that we need from universities is, in those cities where it is, I guess, you know, there is an undersupply of accommodation, there's probably a bit of honesty with, you know, students, particularly if they're being recruited like late in the cycle. I think that's really important. So I think we're just 4 minutes over our allotted time. So I think that's a good point to leave it. What I will do is, there are a few questions we haven't got around to answering. So I will follow up after the session with those questions, and I will send you the link to the recording. All I need to do now is say thanks very much for attending. Keep an eye out for our next session, which will be likely in March, on how students choose accommodation. And I'd like to thank the team for spending some time with us and giving us their opinions today. I hope you found it useful, and I just wanted to bring a bit more of a direct student perspective. And I'd like to say a big thanks to Rhiannon as well, who has done a great job of presenting the research as well as analysing it. So thanks so much for your time, and